Global Institutional Factors and the Persistence of Severe Poverty, a defense of Thomas Pogge's severe poverty as a human rights violation. Imagine a person in poverty. Envision them in accordance with your conception of extreme deprivation. Whether that is a homeless man on the streets of Chicago, or a single mother from Dallas who has to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. An old, sickly woman living alone in Atlanta, or a young West African boy suffering from malnutrition. However you imagine what a person in poverty looks like, focus on that depiction. Now ask yourself this question. Do you care about their well-being? Did you answer yes to this question? If not, then perhaps you're a sociopath who lacks a sense of moral conscience. If that's you, then we needn't go any further. But the rest of us can all agree that there is no serious need to defend the intuition that humans should care about other people's well-being. If you said yes, you must examine the implications of such concern with another person's welfare. Ask yourself the second question. Should the poor be helped? Because we prefer common sense to the radical skepticism that only a philosopher can delight in, we must assume that you, like us, said yes, they should be helped. But this brings in the most important question. Why does your intuition tell you that the poor person you envisioned should be helped? To come up with a completely satisfactory justification for this intuition may not be possible in this presentation, but we will attempt to provide what we think is the most philosophically compelling argument for why we should address poverty. We believe that Thomas Pogge has articulated a credible hypothesis for how institutions play a causal role in perpetuating global poverty. In essence, Pogge argues that the global political and economic system established by Western liberal democracies for their own benefit actively and wrongfully harms the world's poor. Global poverty is not merely a result of industrialized nations doing too little to help the impoverished, but rather the consequence of an economic arrangement that harms the poor. Pogge is concerned with severe poverty because he believes that access to pure water, safe food, clothing and shelter, and basic medical services are of undisputed importance for human life. For Pogge, the fundamental importance of these basic necessities supports the idea that they are pre-existing moral human rights. But in the interest of reaching widely shareable conclusions about severe poverty, he contends that human rights and violations of such rights are to be conceived in the narrowest sense of negative duties. According to him, we violate another person's moral human rights when we deprive her of her rights or when we actively block her access to those rights. But we do not violate her moral human rights if we simply fail to help her when her rights are unfulfilled or threatened. We may violate our duty, but we do not violate her moral human rights. Pogge regards the majority of affluent people who disregard helping the poor as acting in ways that are morally impermissible and profoundly wrong, but he does not find it to be a violation of the poor's moral human rights. So one must ask the question of what causal role the rules of our globalized world economy play in the persistence of severe poverty. In the first place, it is important to remember that existing peoples have arrived at their present levels of social, economic, and cultural development through an historical process that was pervaded by enslavement, colonialism, even genocide. Though these monumental crimes are now in the past, they have left a legacy of great inequalities. We cannot simply overlook that the enormous economic advantage held by developed nations is deeply tainted by how it accumulated over the course of one historical process that has devastated the societies and cultures of 4 continents. The way in which the world economy is currently structured surely affects the overall incidence and the geographical distribution of severe poverty worldwide. The existing global economic order does more than just fail to benefit poor people. It harms them, causes excess poverty, and violates moral human rights. Rich states have imposed the present global economic order by formulating the global economic rules they want, pressing for their acceptance, and prosecuting their enforcement, and these rules are actively causing excess poverty. The rules governing economic transactions are the most important causal determinants of the incidence and depth of poverty. These rules have created an elaborate system of treaties and conventions about trade, investments, loans, patents, and much else. The governments of affluent countries ruthlessly advance their own interests by designing and maintaining a global economic order that foreseeably produces excesses of extreme poverty. The imposers of this unjust social order act with willful indifference to the enormous harms they cause in the course of advancing their own interests. Garrett Hardin would refute even Poge's modest proposal that we have negative duties to not harm the poor. In his Lifeboat Ethics, Hardin concludes that the relatively wealthy should not give up their seat in the boat of life because of the scarcity of available resources on the earth. Though his conclusion might be morally abhorrent, he says that the self-interest of all humans makes it so that there is no room for a guilty or sympathetic conscience in the boat of life. Hardin's conclusion falls flat in many ways, and consequently leads to a strengthening of Poge's defense of negative duties. He says that the state of being in the lifeboat, i.e. of being relatively rich, is good luck. However, he also points out that we are all descendants of thieves. Thus, can we really say that fortune is the only reason for anyone's position in wealth or in poverty? Since Hardin admits that we have not acquired all our wealth in fair trade, he brings in Robert Nozick's principle of just acquisition into the conversation. Nozick writes that people are only entitled to a holding if it was acquired justly. This roughly means that the holding was either unheld and became held, or that it was acquired in a transfer in which both parties agreed. Hardin argues that since no holding has been acquired justly, we should forget the wrongs of the past, as providing restitution would be too difficult. He becomes irrational, rhetorically asking if we should return our land to living descendants of Indians from whom our ancestors took the land. The World Trade Organization has established rules that favor the affluent countries by allowing them to protect their markets through quotas, tariffs, anti-dumping duties, export credits, and subsidies to domestic producers in ways that poor countries are not permitted or cannot afford to match. This results in annual loss of $700 billion in export opportunities for the poor nations. Such asymmetrical rules increase the share of global economic growth going to affluent countries and decreases the share of global economic growth going to poor countries relative to what these shares would be under symmetrical rules of free and open competition. Current global rules harm the poor in more than just unfair trade policies. Wealthy nations are not required to pay for the negative externalities that they impose on the poor, such as the changing environment and climate as a result of pollution. The rules regarding intellectual property rights and the current regime for rewarding and encouraging medical research are established to benefit rich nations. Because wealthy nations do not have a global minimum wage or global regulations on working hours and working conditions, poor countries compete in a race to the bottom in which poor countries compete for foreign investment by outbidding each other by offering more exploitable workforces. The reason why we should alleviate poverty is not because we need to be generous. No, it is because we have imposed an unjust global order that harms poor people, and we owe them compensation. Because affluent governments and their electorates bear primary responsibility for imposing this order, they must be held responsible for alleviating. Poge believes that the present institutional order is unjust on its face and discriminatory in its effects to the advantage of the affluent countries and to the detriment of the poor. Thus his solution targets broad institutional change to bring the major actors in the world together to agree and enforce a new global economic order that will empower the destitute instead of impoverishing them further. Poge maintains that the governments and institutions of Western liberal democracies, such as the United States, have unilaterally established the current global order and are liable for subjugating the less developed countries through the imposition of an unjust social structure. He contends that governments are required to impose social institutions that do not threaten human rights. Poge challenges us to take into account historical circumstances surrounding human suffering. He is not challenging anyone to fulfill a supererogatory duty. Rather, he is simply calling on people, by amending the social arrangements they create, to cease from doing things that directly cause human suffering.